So the really strange thing about doing this video about the Admiralty and the contest of leadership and management, well, we're talking about the period 1628 to 1964. We're talking about events which start 148 years before the United States was founded. And what's really weird, and as I've already discussed in the history of the Royal Navy and the admirals and leadership I've been talking about this year, this is not even the beginning of naval administration in the UK. No, this is the point at which it starts being codified into a form in which we would recognise it. This is the point. This is the period where it codifies into a form which we would recognise it. About 1628. 1628. As discussed in the video about William de Leybourne, the first admiral. The first admiral. As in spelled Admiral and pronounced that way. We can take him back to 1294, 1295. You can take the position of Lord High Admiral of England and Ireland, etc., back to the 4th Earl of Arundel, who held the post between 1385 and 1388. Another, well, 40 odd years earlier. This is the thing. When we're talking about this period and the organisation and structure of the Admiralty, it's not coming from nowhere. This is one of the problems you have when looking at this sort of history, especially of Britain, which is we tend to like to call ourselves an uncodified constitution as a nation, and that's fine, but the reality is we have a lot of traditions and a lot of various other things which are added in, which add on to it. And one of the discussions we're going to get, because today's topic, I'll explain more, is going to be about First Sea Lords more than anything. When we start talking about Third Sea Lords, we have to talk about the position of the controller of the Navy and the power they inherit from that, which is why Third Sea Lords can regularly tell First Sea Lords to go run for one. Because whilst technically the First Sea Lord is supposed to be their boss, because they are made to control the Navy and given a quasi-independent position as head of something called the Navy Board, it gets fun, technically, they can also in certain matters be the First Sea Lord's boss. And yeah, this is me, who regularly in the years of leadership and this year of leadership and in other videos has been talking about how you need clear lines of communication, command and control. You need clear, defined systems for coordinating things and to know a sensible chain of command for making sure everything works out as it's supposed to be done. And that is true. Just don't look at Britain for that. Don't look at Britain for that. We can implement that operationally. We have done. But we've got too much history and too much politics have gone on over a period of, well, let's see, we're in 2025 this year. I'm going to take it back to 1294 because why not? Why not indeed? That's 731 years. Oh, and plus there was stuff before that as well. You have to remember the creation of the Admiral is actually absorbing other roles which have already existed prior to that and other things which have been going on. You can go back further. You can go back further. The thing is, there's been some sort of continuous naval administration going on in Britain for the best part of 800 years. For the best part of 8 centuries. This is the point when we start talking about things like World War I and World War II and the infrastructure advantage the British are having. That infrastructure has been being built up over a long time. It's got deep-seated history. Now, unfortunately, you can, especially look at modern Britain, if you look at modern governments, especially since 1950-ish of Britain, have done a very good job of destroying quite a lot of infrastructure. And therefore, people can have can look at around the UK and go, how could we ever have done this? And I can fully accept that reasoning, because it's very difficult to believe what you cannot see with your own eyes and cannot touch. But you have to remember, for the previous 7 centuries plus, seven centuries and roughly 30 odd years prior to that, it had been very different. In fact, for most of that period, you can make the case, and you can certainly make the argument, that a friend of mine called Sam McLean, who runs the Global Maritime History website and is an absolutely wonderful historian, a wonderful Canadian friend of mine, has done a lot of research into this. You can make the case that the development of administration for the Navy and supporting the naval and maritime infrastructure was what led the development of the nation state administratively for Britain. It was the need to support it through regular taxation. It was the need to invest in the infrastructure, to invest in the organisation behind it, which led to a lot of the reforms in the organisations which went on. And it was a recognised need by the merchant class, the political class. Lots of different parts of British society recognised that, frankly, you needed the Navy, and therefore you needed to support the Navy. And there is always this argument that comes about that it used to be easier to make the case for navies because you didn't have to deal with making it to a large electorate, which is difficult. No, you just made it to a small number of people. And I hear that so often, and actually that's twaddle. That's lazy. Navies have always been strongest and have always been the best tool for their nations and their security when they have made their case to a large pool of people. The We Want 8 campaign the Royal Navy had prior to World War One for battleships was not about getting a small number of people to support them. It's a massive campaign. The trading houses and the big companies in the 19th, 18th and 17th centuries, the reason they support the Navy is not because a small couple of them believe in it. No, it's because the whole host of them are encouraged to believe that, but also have the reason for the Navy explained to them. Sometimes it's very practical because they are merchant traders, they're travelling, they're intimately connected with the movement of goods across the sea, they intimately see the value of a Navy. But in other cases, they don't have that connection. They still know the value of a naval service, and they understand that's part of what they're supporting. There's some interesting quotes from the 18th century, which basically describe the necessary infrastructure of a modern nation. And there are discussions of maintained roads, but of course water connections are more important this time because the roads are terrible. They just are. And a navy is part of the necessary infrastructure. The army is part of it. The army is not. Even island nations, though, need to have a navy for their infrastructure. Because navy's part of the infrastructure of the sea. It's how you secure your freedom on the seas, your movement of your goods, your trade. It's how you control your borders, how you project your power around the world when you need to project power. Sometimes in defense of your interests, sometimes in defense of others whose interests align with you. That's the important thing. That's what it's for. And so, these are things, navies were part of this. Now, today we're going to be talking about the Royal Navy and the development of the Admiralty and the office of the First Sea Lord. I'll explain more about this in a second. From 1628 onwards. Prior to 1628, it's worthwhile noticing that you have the office of the Lord High Admiral, and the Admiralty and Marine Affairs Office, who are both sort of dealing with administration, and there's also various other admirals in various other positions. And sometimes the Lord High Admiral is a political appointment, but usually they're a political appointment kind of like Lord Howard of Effingham, in that, yes, he's a noble. Yes, he's given the role. Yes, he can absolutely command a fleet and has more than enough experience and has spent his whole lifetime training to it, because that's what he's for. That's what his family is. And it's a kind of a weird scenario in that you find sometimes you'll have nobles petitioning for positions, and it won't go to the most senior noble who's petitioning for the position, and they'll be told, you don't have the experience necessary. And in a pure nobility aristocratic system, the most senior noble asking for the role should get it. Should, in theory, if that's what you're running the system on. But you're not. In the UK, it became quite a fashion often to make sure you had a connection to the Admiralty and that role through a marriage alliance with one of the Admiralty noble families. If you wanted to keep the Admiralty on side and make sure the Admiralty was part of your faction, you needed to have someone in your family circle who had the right training. And it was easier for you to marry a daughter into that family than you to try and nick one of their sons into yours. Because often they would still be going off and serving their family. But even marrying your daughters into it was something that's sometimes quite difficult. They were often referred to as being a bit of a closed tribe. They were more likely to marry, how to put this, girls and ladies from families with maritime connections, maybe of lower levels than themselves, than they were necessary to marry those daughters of other noble families. Now, you might wonder, why is that? Well, if you remember correctly, if you've watched any of my other videos, I've talked before about the informal staff of an admiral, and how often their wives, etc., do go to sea with them. And you can go back quite a long way and find the female members of the family going to see them. Why? Because they need someone to write a lot of letters. Well, that's why it becomes a bit of a closed shop. Because these men spend most of the time at sea, and the families make sure the right daughters are introduced to the right sons. It's always amazing how well it goes. Oh no, we don't have a history of arranged marriages. No, we just make sure that these teenagers are the only two teenagers who are not related, of opposite genders and right age, are off together, and they're the only ones who can keep each other company for a few months on end, and then are surprised when they want to get married. It's amazing. But no, not arranged marriages. No. Arranged marriages were something higher nobility did, not naval nobility. No, they didn't do that at all. What are you talking about? Anyway, off topic, but it's a bit of a fun bit of history. I've got a friend who's doing a PhD on it, and I want to get her on two historians to talk about it, because it is just so hilarious what some of the families get up to. I mean, they did all the time protesting, we do not do arranged marriages. It's hilarious. Anyway, by the time you get... The Admiralty Marine Office comes into existence in 1546. It had been preceded from 1414 to 1546 by the Admiralty Office. But the Admiralty and Marine Office and, Lord High Admiral, all these things, they are reformed by putting the position of Lord High Admiral into commission. Now, basically, what that means is you are going, this post is now so important, so permanent, and so administratively taxing, we can't designate it to a single person anymore. So we're going to put this into commission. There's going to be multiple lords. They're going to exercise the authority of the Lord High Admiral by commission. Okay? So this is why the Lord High Admiral's flag becomes, well, the Admiralty flag to an extent. And they're working alongside, initially, the Navy Board. Initially, they're working alongside the Navy Board. And eventually, the Navy Board and the Board of Admiralty are joined in, but the Navy Board exists till 1832. The Navy Board are pretty much dealing with everything to do with docks and infrastructure of the Navy. So if you can imagine it, the Admiralty are running the Navy. The Navy Board are looking at the infrastructure. Now, this is where it's come into some interesting conversations in the past I've had with people in comments, etc., because I have to explain this. The Navy Board is both technically part of the Admiralty and separate to it. And technically, when ships are taken from commission and put into ordinary, they no longer belong to the Admiralty, they belong to the Navy Board. Which is why they're administered through the dockyards, and the people aboard them are not naval personnel. They're usually dockyard workers. Now this causes fun, because those same dockyard workers would tend to become the carpentry teams and various other teams of professionals who get folded into the crew when she commissions. So they are also naval personnel when the ship commissions. But when the ship decommissions, they stay with the ship, but that's because the ship now has been returned to the board, and so it's administered under those duties. And people like the purser, etc., will often stay with the ship. This causes fun sometimes, because people go, well, are they her permanent? Does that mean the ship stayed in commission? Are they her permanent? No. Because basically those personnel shift their employment over to the administration of the board, which employs them on a very different metric than the Admiralty. But they shift between these two organisations almost seamlessly, which is kind of weird for us to think about in terms of administration, thinking it's that sort of level at that time period, but it makes sense. It makes sense because you've got the pay scales for the dockyards and dockyard workers, and you've got the pay scales for sailors and sea time, and the effects of risk and other roles and duties. But let's be honest, if you can get one of those posts through the dockyards, that's pretty much permanent employment. There's no going off onto half pay. Okay, you don't get quite the same pay as you do for sea service, but you still get good pay. You get accommodation, you get looked after. There are advantages to this. Now, this is also where you get some of the fun where people start talking, well, hang on. Is this where some of the women aboard the ships come from? And you would be right. Because while the ship's out of commission, and the dockyard workers, who are the ones who are looking after that ship, are technically living on board her, they can bring their families aboard. And sometimes those women would stay aboard ship as washerwomen, etc. And this is why we have children being born during the Battle of Trafalgar and other battles. There you go. It all makes sense. It all follows, but this is some of the transition we have. And you have to also remember that sometimes some of the separation of these organisations in this period and early periods was about keeping the level of corruption to manageable levels. You see, the very composition you'd set up between the Navy Board and the Admiralty, the very debates they'd have going on, the various interplays they'd have between their roles, Well, those keep each other honest. The tension of the Admiralty with the Navy Board. The Admiralty often had problems with the Navy Board because guess what? Who the Navy Board contained? Well, it contained the treasure of the Navy. Now, in 1628, when King Charles I was doing these reforms, had been persuaded he needed to do these reforms and form this sort of organise this thing, these are the people who are filling the roles. Now, I've got some of the posts from Navy Board which were not, I've put in all the various posts that were ever really named Navy Board, because it's worthwhile talking them through. But we're going to keep going over some of these slides. Probably this one will turn up quite regularly throughout this series as we go through the various different roles in the Navy Board. As we go through the various roles. And there are so many fun roles. Now, what you also have to remember is that originally there were up to 12 Sea Lords. And they weren't numbered. There was just the Senior Lord, who equates to the First Lord of the Admiralty. Most of those positions, in terms of enumerated positions, in the terms of the Sea Lords, no, First Sea Lord was the Senior Lord. The First Lord of the Admiralty is the political one. Just so many lords in this. Just making sure I clarify and say it clearly. Most of the enumerated positions, i.e. Second Sea Lord, Third Sea Lord onwards, are things which come in terms of, how do I put this, enumerating their titles in 1830 and 1830 onwards. The point you have to remember at the Third Sea Lord is they have a title of Control of the Navy. If you go and look over here, you'll see a title called Comptroller of the Navy. Clarke, previously Clarke Controller of the Navy, is chairman of the board of the Navy Board, and basically chief administrator and chief of dockyards, head of all the infrastructure that sustains the Navy, in charge of all procurement, everything, all those agreements go through him. Now, there is always an interesting counterplay between this, because whilst the Controller of the Navy technically reports to the First Lord of the Admiralty, they don't report to the First Sea Lord. The First Sea Lord has a semi-oversight position over them, but the First Sea Lord or Senior Lord, Naval Lord, cannot fire or fire them. And the thing is, when the Third Sea Lord, after 1830, is acting in their position as Comptroller of the Navy, the same rules apply, in that they serve at the pleasure not of the First Sea Lord, but at the First Lord of the Admiralty. And whilst technically the First Sea Lord is probably a senior admiral to them and is technically their boss as head of the Navy, they also cannot be fired and cannot be overruled on matters of competency which fall within the remit of their duties as Controller of the Navy. It's fun. And there is a debate over that, because, as some people say, well, that's not enunciated in the rules, that's by tradition. The thing is, it's by tradition, culture, and heritage of the installer position, and if we look at the precedents of every Third Sea Lord, up until the post of Third Sea Lord was removed, it was always held true that the First Sea Lord could not countermand an order given by Third Sea Lord in their duties as Controller of the Navy. And the only times First Sea Lords tried, they lost. And they lost badly. I'm not going to get into it here, but there are two First Sea Lords who basically lost their position because they tried that one. One prior to 1830 and one post 1830, when it was the combined with the role of Third Sea Lord. So it's an interesting position. It's a fun position. It's something which you will only find in the British Constitution. Such a position, okay? Yeah. The Navy Board has the Treasurer of the Navy, the Surveyor of the Navy, who was originally called the Surveyor and Rigger of the Navy, the Clerk of the Navy. That's a role which is most famously held by Samuel Pepys. Basically that's the senior administrator of the senior admin position, Secretary of the Navy. Then you have Surveyor of the Marine Victuals. Usually 2 people. They're ordered with finding food and making sure there's enough food and stores for the Navy. And from Elizabeth I onwards, this position is added in by Elizabeth I. And pretty much from her onwards, it's constant. It's added in by Elizabeth I. It's added in again by James I after he comes to power when people try and get rid of it. And then it's added in by Charles I, because again, similar things happen. And by the time Charles II turns up, there's been someone in that post throughout the interregnum. It's just constant from then on. And usually there's 2 people in that role. It's a very big job. It's a very expensive job, and it's a job which is probably, out of here, the most prone to risk of people trying to commit various versions of fraud. However, it's also the post which has the most scrutiny and is in many ways the most easy to find out fraud. Which is why there are people who serve in that role for a long time, and there are people who serve very short amount of time because they get in the role thinking it's going to be very financially interesting and intoxicating, and find out very quickly that if they deliver on all their promises to their friends who are promising them money, they will shortly lose the promising connection of their head, neck, and body. Sometimes through legal means, coupled through more interesting methodologies. And, as mentioned, control of the Navy. Technically, Clarke controlled the Navy. Chairman of the board from 1660 onwards. Possibly one of the most powerful people in the British political system. Not only did they control all the naval dockyards, pretty much they controlled the naval dockyard vote, which meant they pretty much decided who would be members of Parliament for those areas. It didn't matter which party you were from, you needed them to give you a nod. If they were sensible, they were never party political. They made sure all the candidates for that particular area were signed off by them. They didn't care what party you were from, just as you were the clerk controllers portion of the Navy. Now, then you have the keeper of the storehouses, the clerk of the storehouses. It's a role which is merged with the treasurer from 1560 onwards. Now, the treasurer of the Navy would tend to sometimes revert and use the title of keeper of the storehouses depending on what duty they're doing. Usually, they would call themselves treasurer of the Navy when they're acting on the board. However, when they are demanding admittance, because of the rules, whilst the treasurer of the Navy cannot demand admittance to the dockyards at all hours, can only demand admittance during the hours when the gates were manned, and there were sentries at the post to open the gates to them, the keeper of the storehouses, by tradition, is allowed to inspect those storehouses at any time, or day or night. Remember? The anti-grift rules. And, well, therefore, you would sometimes get the Treasurer of Navy would turn up at a dockyard, and if they wanted to do an inspection and it was out of hours, they would start calling themselves the keeper of the storehouses. Because you could refuse entry to the Treasurer of the Navy, believe it or not, you can't refuse entry to the Keeper of the Storehouses. People often wonder where the character of Ponder Stimmons from the Unseen University in Terry Pratchett's Ankh-Morpork comes from. And if you haven't read those books, you won't have any frame of reference, but please note, he's a member of the senior staff of the university. And it's after a few years they realise he has so many titles that pretty much he has the controlling vote on the board of the university. And they decide something needs to be done about this, so they ask him to they ask for free titles, specific titles, to investigate it and decide what to do. Ponder Stimmons, of course, has all those titles. So basically, they're demanding he has a meeting with himself, and himself. It works, but yeah, it's not modelled necessarily on universities. It could also be modelled on the British Navy Board and the way it works out and the way decisions go. Because here's the fun thing. When I say the controller duty goes to the Third Sea Lord, remember, Third Sea Lord is also Secretary of the Navy. They also get the storehouses duty. Goes to them. Which is also one of the reasons why, if there's any storehouse, by tradition, if you keep any stores for the Navy on your dockyard, you have to be able to, you have to allow the keeper of the stores to be able to come to your dockyard and see them. So even if you're a private yard producing a ship for the Royal Navy, something like that, if you have got any Navy stores stored on your site as part of that construction, and you keep them there, you have got to allow access to the keeper of the storehouses whenever they want to show up. Which is why Third Sea Lords can turn up unannounced in shipyards and demand entry at any point, at any time they fancy, causing consternation of directors and everyone else who's going, "Ah, they're here to check up on us, we didn't know they were coming." And First Sea Lords can't. As First Sea Lords, while technically can't award the contracts, because that goes through the controller of the Navy, which is the Third Sea Lord, and B are not keeper of the stores, which is the Third Sea Lord. The Third Sea Lord gets that title. There's a debate sometimes about whether or not they get that title, but the point is no one's really appointed that title. That title is within the purview of the controller, and they definitely get the controller's title and get the roles. So it's fun. It's a fun bit of naval history. And the only reason I bring this up is because there are 3 Third Sea Lords, including Admiral Henderson, who I can point to and go, there are events where, according to at least one source I've read, he refers to himself as the keeper of the storehouses, in order to say I'm allowed entrance whenever I want. And it was when a member of Parliament was cross-examining him and asking him why he felt he could turn up at a yard on a Sunday, when everyone was in church, everyone was going to church. Why was he disturbing a yard's peace on a Sunday? Why was he not respecting the Lord's Day? Because I'm the keeper of the storehouses, and that was the day I could check that yard. I have to carry out my duty. It works. So yes, we have all these interesting people, and in 1628 we have in these roles Sir Sackville Crowe as Treasurer of the Navy. So technically at this point, how do I put this? Technically at this point, still as the senior commissioner of the board, acts as chair of the board when the First Lord of the Admiralty is not available to chair the board. Now, as mentioned, 1660 onwards, the control of the Navy becomes chair of the board. This is by some excellent political manoeuvring by the control of the Navy at the time. And still, when the First Lord of the Admiralty comes, they don't chair the board. Prior to that, when they're there, they chair the board, and the Treasurer of the Navy chairs it when they're not there. But after 1660, the Controller always chairs the board, even when the First Lord of the Admiralty is there. It's a beautiful position. But basically, these people are making sure the Navy has what it needs. That's what they're in charge of. So anytime there's problems with infrastructure supply, anytime there's problems with getting ships ready, anytime there's a problem with anything like that, these are the people who theoretically get the blame. These are the people in charge of making sure those ships, when available, are used right. Okay? Basically, the Surveyor of the Navy title goes to, eventually, the Director of Naval Construction. So that's where they get their power from. Again, I've talked about how the Directors of Naval Construction have quite so much power and quite so much influence. Well, once you look at the rules and regulations around the Surveyor and rigor of the Navy, and as they're empowered on the Surveyor of the Navy, and as what happens when you have the Naval Constructor and they inherit those powers, you suddenly start to realize that basically what the Navy does in 1830, when you get in the 30s, when you're getting rid of the board, is pretty much copy and paste those roles across to people in the Third Sea Lord's office mostly. So basically, the Navy board becomes almost the Third Sea Lord's office, and that then explains how they function until 1964, when you have all sorts of changes go through and you have things organised in a different way. So for about 126 years. So today's discussion is about some First Sea Lords. That's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about how various First Sea Lords did in their leadership role and what they did. And some of them we'll talk about are going to be senior naval lords, not First Sea Lords, because there weren't such things. And what's going to be probably quite interesting is the number of senior naval lords who then would go on to become First Lords of the Admiralty. So remember, they weren't First Sea Lords because the Royal Navy didn't have First Sea Lords initially. They were called the Senior Naval Lord. And they weren't necessarily the most senior naval officer in the country as well. Sometimes they'd be actually relatively junior. They were chosen for political reasons. But as time goes on and you start to professionalize, well, they change. Their roles change, their experience change, and what you're looking for changes. Because at a certain point it's realized that having a really good admiral who's a great commander at sea is great. But if they're terrible at administration, then they're not going to make a good First Sea Lord. And there's another reason why at a certain point you start to realize that, oh, you were a Third Sea Lord and now you're First Sea Lord. You were a Third Sea Lord and now you're First Sea Lord. And you start to realize, oh, well, that makes sense, because the Third Sea Lord in many ways is the post which is most close to First Sea Lord in its roles. In fact, in many ways, the Third Sea Lord is the domestic political position, and the First Sea Lord is the international relations, foreign policy political position when it comes to naval management. One is about managing the domestic side of the Navy. One is about managing the global role of the Navy. And so, yes, one is good training for the other, because one gives you a safe, familiar background with lots of staff to support you, doing fairly predictable, fairly understandable things whilst you learn how politics work, and the other one is you implementing those skills on a global stage. But today we're looking at the firsts. Without much further ado, it's time for the Shameless Book Plug. Shameless Book Plug. Now, what am I going to say in today's Shameless Book Plug? Well, I'm going to say thank you for watching the videos. Hope you enjoyed them. You might have noticed that I've started doing a thing where I try and record videos much further in advance, and I'm slightly trying to push them further ahead, and this video kind of got delayed because A, it was being recorded, but also that helped me push the videos enough ahead that even though I was going to be away for a couple of days with Justin and Craig, everything can meld together seamlessly and we would have videos. So yes, I'm trying to get into a process whereby videos are done far enough ahead that there isn't a disruption if I have a couple of days of builders or people in. It's like I've also tried to... I'm now scheduling the next batch of recordings for 2 historians because of... touch wood, touch wood, touch wood, touch every piece of plausible wood around me. We'll be able to not for a bit have people traipsing through the house, so I'll be able to do a recording without the very nice people who are excellent of Trident, who are a wonderful electrical, plumbing and building firm, general contractors in the southwest, based out of Falmouth. Lovely people walking behind me. We need to sell the old house as well, but you know, there are things I can do and the things I can't do, and one of them is I can't really act as my own estate agent when I'm several hundred miles away from the property. We'll leave that to one side. We've got a very good one doing the job right now. So I want to say thank you to everyone for liking, sharing, subscribing to videos. Thank you for supporting the channel. Thank you for helping it grow. And thank you to everyone who's bought books. And there are more books coming. My aim is to have one published as a sort of late birthday present to myself in end of March, beginning of April. That's the next one to come out. The pictures should all be there by then. I should be happy with it by then. But the trouble is, the more I go through it as I'm editing it and practicing with the software to upload it as a Kindle book and turn it into a Kindle direct publishing, so it can you can order it as a hard copy from Kindle or as a digital copy. The more I go through that, the more I'm editing it. So we'll leave that to one side. It will come out. It will be out soon. I should probably have a date for it, but I don't want to have a date for it until I have everything in place, and then I can just go, yes, it'll be coming out at this point. I'm just doing the final tweaks, and that's going to be my deadline to do the final tweaks. It's fun. And I thank you for your support. Thank you for making this possible, and thank you for helping the channel be the channel. And, well, we're going to start off with the Earl of Orford. So really, you have to start by looking at Russell's senior career as, well, as a thing of beauty. It truly is a thing of beauty. You see, if I just give you the dates and then I'm going to explain the details. He became a captain on 10th of June 1672, but then falls out of favour with King James II and has various issues. But don't worry, after being part of the Immortal Seven who invite William and Mary to come to the UK and become the new king and queen of the United Kingdom, well, you don't worry, he gets promoted directly from captain to admiral in May 1689. But at the same time, he's made Treasurer of the Navy, which he serves on, of course, the Navy Board. He'll serve in that post for 10 years. Without break, because getting someone off the Navy Board is kind of like getting someone out of tenure in an academic institution. You don't just have to find a smoking gun, you have to find them actually physically holding the smoking gun over several, bodies. But don't worry, he also becomes the senior naval lord in June 1690. This is just after he's joined the Navy Board, the Admiralty Board in May 1690. And he serves in that role till January 1691. And then he goes off and does other duties and is gone away. But then don't worry, he comes back. He's still, by the way, during this time, still Treasurer of the Navy. Then he becomes Senior Naval Lord and First Lord of the Admiralty, combining both posts. He's both the Senior Naval Lord and the First Lord of the Admiralty, so he's both the political head and the operational head of the Navy. He does that role from May 1694 to May 1699. What a time just to be alive. And then he's merely First Lord of the Admiralty between November 1709 to September 1710 and October 1714 to January 1717. You know, all those positions which we talked about before the Shameless book plug, before, you know, when we talked about these positions and how theoretically having these positions and the differentiation between them was to prevent a certain level of, how should I say this, self-enrichment of a financial rather than educational nature. I give you Edward Russell, who not only sets and marks his own homework, but sets and marks his own schoolwork, and sets and marks his own marking. And possibly his own course. It's... Seriously, this man is the living embodiment of the academic dream. You literally... There is no one who can tell you with an accurate thing that you are doing the wrong thing, because there is no one who has any professional standing to disagree with you. You are pretty much your own boss and boss's boss. Although that does lead to the whole interesting thing of technically the treasurer is not the senior member of the board at this point. It's the controller. But you have to remember, he's also technically the boss of the controller as the First Lord of the Admiralty. Now, I picked Russell to start off this discussion because I wanted to give you an idea of just how muddy the waters can get when we started talking about these positions. And I want to explain that sometimes I have people write comments where they go, well, you're saying they're calling this person by this position, but this person says they're this position, and this person says they're this position. And it could be that one of us is wrong, but also it could be, technically, they are holding all those positions simultaneously. And if we are talking about him acting in his role as Treasurer of the Navy, we need to talk of him as the Treasurer of the Navy, because that's when he's doing the financial duties. But if we talk about him in his political role, we need to talk about him as the First Lord of the Admiralty. And if we talk about him in his operational role of giving out orders to fleets and telling admirals where to position themselves and sending off people and giving them commands, he's the senior naval lord. The fact that one man is all three doesn't mean he isn't simultaneously all three. Now, the Earl of Orford is actually, to an extent, worthy of that role. To an extent. He's fought in a few battles, the Battle of Solebay and the battles of Harfleur and La Hogue. He has done duties, he has commanded ships, and for want of a better description, he is a professional naval officer. He has served well. Yes, he's a politician. Yes, he's intimately connected with the Whigs. But he's also good at his job. And the Battle of Barfleur, which takes place in 1692, and if you're looking at that, unless you're going, hang on, did he literally go in 1691 when he was January, go, okay, so the politics are interesting, I should go off and command a fleet? Pretty much. And he commands a battle against the French. Admittedly, he does take 82 ships of the line, 3 fire ships, and 39,000 men off to fight a French force of 44 ships of the line, 2 frigates, a fire ship, and 21,000 men. You know, there is this whole thing of, may God favours the brave and people with 2-to-1 odds. Honestly, he had roughly the same number killed and wounded as his French counterparts in the battle. The thing is, he lost 2 ships of the line sunk. The French lost 15. And 2 frigates. And a fire ship. He lost It also is 3 fireships as well, to be fair, but there again, he was starting with 82, so him losing 2 is... oh. That's annoying. That's like, what, less than 2.5% of my force? 2.3% of my force I've lost? I don't want to lose that. But, you know. The French lost a third. It's a good victory. It's also a hard-fought battle. And for the time, it was a decisive battle, you can argue. You know, the aftermath allowed a lot of things to happen, including a massive fleet review, including there's all sorts of nice Dutch news pamphlets about what Russell has achieved, and he has done it well. He has. Thanks to its thwarting of invasion attempts, it's, well, let's be honest, Winston Churchill, who's never known to be shy or bashful about these things, decided to describe it as the Trafalgar of the 17th century. I'm surprised similar politicians turned historians have not picked up on Barfleur, but that's probably because it's lack of fame. To be fair, Barfleur at points you can hand as a bit of a tactical victory to the French, but that's because, to an extent, it's kind of like Jutland. They won by running away. That doesn't sound right. And most of the consensus has been outside of France that, I'm sorry, France, you lost. Own it. That doesn't mean your admiral, that Tourville, didn't do a bloomin' good job and isn't deserving of a lot of praise for doing that, because doing a fighting retreat at this period is... it's skill. But, yeah, it wasn't a victory. The thing is, what does Russell do in his time as First Sea Lord? Or rather, First Lord of the Admiralty, Senior Naval Lord, Treasurer of the Navy, and pretty much every other role he could accrue. Well, he actually does quite a lot. When we're talking about a Navy, he's guiding it through a very, very, how do I put this, fragile political time. He's doing his best to build up the Navy to the strength he can do. And whilst he did often face issues, he starts to establish what is an acceptable level of graft. And he starts to establish some of the precedents that various lords would use down through the future. One of them was that if you had the same contractors build your home as built, let's say, the facilities at a naval dockyard, and they built your home to a far finer standard than they built the dockyard, you could hold them to account over that. You want the same quality. Not necessarily the same artistic value, but there's a difference between what it looks like, style, and quality. Styling, that's personal taste. Quality, that is universal. And you might be thinking, there shouldn't be any corruption. Well, the thing is, that's the point. This is how you maneuver in a patronage-based system. And this is what, at this period, you're very much in. You're very much in a system whereby the builders might well be patronized, supported, by far more powerful lords who'd be putting them forward. To say no to them would cause trouble. You need to have a way to control them which fits within the system. And the thing is, if they've done good work for you, and they've done good work for the Lord, and you recommend them for another big famous Lord, and you recommend them for something, and then they don't do good work on the dockyard, suddenly you can claim, well, it's down to their badness. It's not a reflection on me, or the Lord who recommended them, it's down to them. And that's the thing. We're in a patronage system. If someone does wrong, if someone mucks up, you have to be careful. Because if their patron is powerful enough, and you make it reflect on them, then they will use their power to crush you, and you will never get it sorted out. But if you can set the system up so you can divide them from their patron, then you have a chance, then they're exposed. And the thing is, the smart craftsmen, the smart people who are involved in the system, very quickly understood that's the game that's being played. You do bad quality on his house, he's not going to recommend you. And if the Lord says anything, and it goes, well, look how he mucked up my house. I can't in good conscience recommend him, can I? Now, to our eyes, that's terrible. And even the people at the time, they would often use these things to attack them, but honestly, everyone was doing it. Because the patronage system was how you had to work in a system where there isn't things like checker trade, which is an iffy system in many ways, but various other social media systems and newspapers, etc. You are literally using a trust but verify system in a word-by-mouth world. We often talk about advertising, messing with advertising being word by mouth. It can be. But if that person is saying, well, I heard this person did a good job, so I recommend them. Or saying, well, they've done a good job for me, so I recommend them. Which one do you trust most? It's often easy to look back in the past and call them corrupt and all sorts of things. And to an extent, they are. That's not wrong. But there's a reason for it. There's a logic by it. And this is the system they had to play in. Again, First Lords of the Admiralty, senior naval lords, these men had to play within the system they were given. They're not the major political leaders at a time who can afford to try and change the system. That's not the benefit they have of their position. Their position is to get the best out of it for the Navy that they can. And sometimes that means doing things interestingly. And then we have Byng, who is pretty much, how do I put this politely? Well, Russell's protege. So why do I say protege? And by the way, this is not the Byng who managed to get his himself. This is his dad. Okay? This is a man who, when he is in service as a senior naval lord on 1720, gets himself made the Treasurer of the Navy as well, which a post which he holds until 1724, when he passes it on to his son. And not his son who's the naval officer, his son who's the army officer, and who will succeed him as Viscount Torrington. That's real skill. Having enough political clout to put an army officer. Again, another of those officers who was very involved in the bringing across of William and Mary and securing of their fleet's support for it. Because you have to remember, the big problem the Royal Navy and the existing force structures had with James II wasn't necessarily that he was Catholic. It would have been annoying if he'd been Catholic, but as long as he'd at least respected the Protestant institutions and hadn't looked like he was going to have a Catholic successor, and remember, this is a population which remembers the wars of religion they had suffered, and they had dealt with not that long ago, the joys of being transitioning from, well, let's be honest, Edward, as in Henry VIII's son Edward regime, to Mary's regime, then back to Queen Elizabeth I's regime, and all the other fun they'd had during the various religious factions fighting in the War of the Three Kingdoms, aka known as the Civil War period. There was a desire not to have much religion involved. Then he went and had himself a son. Okay, this is a problem. Oh, and you're also trying to change the officer corps. Not necessarily for the better. Yes, you can't argue with some of the people he's putting in charge. They have skills, they have capabilities. It's not wrong. But there are also a fairly large number of them who are being put in charge because of their religious affiliation. See how that's going to look worrying? And, well, previously, it had been Mary who was going to take over. Mary was the eldest daughter. Mary was the natural successor. That had been what had been thought and planned when Charles II was alive. Kings. Again, one of the I've already talked about how for the admirals they have to work within the system. It's the same for everyone who's part of the system. Yes, a king can change the system, but even they can only change it so much before they run into trouble, especially in this period. But even in the modern day, there is always the ability to correct it. There are always problems. Pushing too hard too fast, especially if you alienate your potential allies. See, James actually had a lot of assets in the Navy, a lot of people who rather liked a professional naval force. Him pushing down one side of his reforms would probably have actually got their support. Him pushing down the reforms and trying to put in friends who they don't understand why he's necessarily putting him in, other than trying to secure personal authority over the fleet, that causes issues. Couple in the religion factor, couple in his... Generally, James II was just not that good at politics. Really wasn't. Charles II was absolutely great at politics. James II was a very good field commander of forces, but was used to having the power and authority that comes with you commanding naval forces or land forces, and you are a general or an admiral, and you are the ultimate authority because it's a military chain of command under that circumstance. Fine. Doesn't necessarily make you good at politics. It's the other fun when you have people from all walks of life. If you are very good in your natural walk of life, it doesn't necessarily translate you're going to be good at politics. Because often the better you are in your field, the more respect you have, and the more even if you don't have official power, implicit power, you're going to have an influence. The people aren't going to question you. You're going to be used to be able to giving out orders and people doing what you say without questioning or back-talking. I noticed this even in my own field, academia. I love being a university lecturer. I do. But to be honest, whilst I don't always enjoy some of the rudeness in terms of name-calling you still get on the internet, I find it pretty good to have the debates you have, because on the internet, behind screens, people will be far more frank and debate history with you than they will necessarily do in person when you're the lecturer sitting up at the front of the room, especially the larger the lecture theatre. It's a little quirk of history which people often forget when it comes to crowd control. But it's actually easier to control 1,000 people from a lectern than it is a dozen people sitting around a table. That's one of the reasons why juries are the size they are. The bigger a jury gets, the more it adopts a herd mentality, and the more it's easy to sway. There is an actual and ideal size if you want to have a debate, if you want to have a proper discussion. Now, the thing is about Byng, what does he do? What's his big innovation for naval information and naval infrastructure and naval management? Because, again, he's a senior naval lord under Russell. He is First Lord of the Admiralty. He dies in office. He has status. He has power. He has all sorts of things to give him this capability. Well, honestly, as senior command, what he does most, and what he really wants to do as part of the Admiralty Board, is make it more into extent efficient in how people are promoted. This is a period where you're starting to transition from the core of officers who have basically been the cabal running things because of their support of William and Mary and the succession that's come after that. You're starting to get the next generation of officers coming through, starting to get them growing up. And this means you need to find a way of making sure they're both loyal and effective. Because whilst you can afford to have army officers who are loyal, the sea tends to kill off officers who aren't effective. So again, you have to start thinking about the patronage system and how it's going to affect and how it's going to be in place. There's actually a great line in this book, which is Nicholas Rogers' Command of the Ocean, that this is the period at which the Admiralty starts to become the centre of the naval system, rather its head. And it's rather unusual in that between Russell, aka Lord Orford, and Byng, aka Torrington, you start to have this policy that not just the first Sea Lords, the senior naval lords, have to be professional officers of high expertise, but you have to have the First Lord also has to have expertise to be an effective minister and run an effective ministry, which is rather unique amongst the British cabinet positions. There's also an argument as to what that's why eventually the Ministry of Defence, etc., comes about, is because it had become realised that the posts as they existed in times of the War Office, the Admiralty, and the Air Ministry required ministers who had expertise. And that was a problem. Because finding ministers with expertise who fit the right moulds for governments was far more difficult than changing the system so that the ministers didn't need the expertise. They were sufficiently insulated from the actual services that they didn't actually need to know much about them. Slightly cutting remark, and I would say ever since ministers, after realising this, have been working very hard to try and know their services, but the trouble is, when we're talking about this period, and for quite a little period after, it's usually the First Lords of the Admiralty and the First Sea Lords, or the senior naval lords as they were in this period, had to work very closely together to get these expertise and to make sure the information was passed on. And often the lords, kind of in the mold of, well, Howard of Effingham, Lord Howard of Effingham, who I talked about in a video not that long ago when this comes out. They have to be lords who've got understanding of what they're talking about in order to be effective. Naval administration was rapidly becoming very, very, how do I put this, complex. In fact, there are arguments at times that naval administration in this period was far more of an equivalent to the modern civil service than the whole civil service or what existed of it as it was at a time. Let's be honest, the Navy Board and the Admiralty both had versions of social programs. They both had to deal with healthcare. They both had to deal with food, infrastructure, personnel management. One of the most interesting things is when you start to realise that, when you're looking at it, especially under Byng, but of course a legacy in part of Pepys, which has been expanded on, you're getting the beginnings of an HR department in some regards, because there's an actual professional system tracking officers' careers, tracking their experience, making sure they've ticked certain boxes, they've passed lieutenant's exams, before they can go on to senior positions. And there are several points at which officers can suddenly find themselves out of the race for senior officer. Yes, it might be a seniority system, but, well, I'm sorry. You haven't got enough sea time, have you? We can't promote you. Oh, well, you were unfortunately on deployment on the other side of the world, and we need an admiral for the Mediterranean immediately, so we had to promote who was here. This is when that management is really starting to kick off. It might not be the methodology we use today, but it's a methodology, and it was fitting with, again, the functions of the time they were in. Which then moves on to Keppel. What's interesting most about Keppel is that he's probably an example of some of the worst of the system. He readily could consider his political opponents to be guilty of any villainy. He even thought that when he was off commanding a fleet, that they would be happy if he lost because it would embarrass the other side. Now, as I've talked about before, noble factions, if they wanted control at court, they had to have someone who was capable of naval in terms of being had enough naval experience to run the ministry. As those factions turn into political parties, the Whigs and Tories, or the forerunners of the Liberal Democrats and the Conservative Party in the UK, well, that politics becomes even more vicious. But it also becomes even more divisive at certain points. People are putting party before country. Or rather, they presume everyone's putting party before country. Sometimes, even when they are most viciously agreeing on something, realistically, when you look at what they're aiming for, they will believe each side is guilty of the greatest villainy. It's one of those things which sets apart is that after this period, slowly, especially the Admiralty, becomes very keen. After the Keppel-Palliser affair is a good example, and in fact, Keppel was involved in that, of course, when he felt that his second-in-command was deliberately undermining him because he was from a different political party, a different political faction, and honestly, both of them, neither shone great out of that scenario, neither did. But after this scenario, and after his involvement even higher, the Navy as a whole becomes very desirous to keep itself out of politics in some ways. I.e., you can have the fights, you can be of different political positions, but you're a naval officer first. It's a sad thing that Keppel, who was actually probably a good naval officer, was far more of a politician than he was anything else. And the fact is that he is kind of weird because he ends up becoming First Lord of the Admiralty in the after the North Ministry falls in 1782. He basically the government which comes in afterwards, the ministry which comes in afterwards. But he then decries his old political party and his old friends because of the Peace of Paris. He doesn't like it. He disagrees with it fundamentally. And we're talking about the Peace of Paris from 1783. That's one of the reasons why he is First Lord of the Admiralty for such a short amount of time. And it's also one of the reasons why he's Senior Naval Lord for such a short amount of time, is because, well, frankly, he doesn't like it. He pretty much is Senior Naval Lord while still a Rear Admiral. Not any more senior than that. He's only a Rear Admiral. He's Senior Naval Lord, though, because of political connections. And basically, he hates it. He despises it. And leaves it as quickly as he can, because he isn't good at the politics. He's very passionately political, but very bad at it, and complains about it. He is a good naval officer, but he is, well, to use the words of Burke, and I'm talking about Edmund Burke, the statesman, philosopher that so many people like to quote these days, but haven't seemed to read, kind of like Mahan, they have a few of his quotes, but they haven't really read him. He's far more complicated and far more nuanced than the quotes often attributed to him suggest. Described him as something high in his high nature. It has a wild stock of pride on which the tenderest of all hearts are grafted the milder virtues. Keppel tried. He wasn't very good at it. He's a good cautionary tale, really, because he tries to bring in all sorts of good ideas, but he jumps from ministry to ministry. He tries to be a politician and he can't, because ultimately he was too into the politics. You see, as I've already remarked, the ministry had already developed a taste of you needed to be a professional first and a politician second in order to be an effective First Sea Lord, let alone Senior Naval Lord. First Lord of the Admiralty, let alone Senior Naval Lord. Gets even more complicated once they become First Sea Lord and First Naval Lord, or First Lord of the Admiralty. You're just two firsts. You need to have the professionalism, yes, but you need to be able to separate the professionalism from the politics. Keppel couldn't do that. We like to think of this as being something modern, which affects modern leaders, affects modern governments, that people can't separate the politics from the professional, but it's not. It's been a part of society, it's been part of civil services, militaries, everything for as long as there's been politics. And there's been politics as long as there's been humans living together in groups. If you honestly believe there wasn't politics back in the times when everyone lived in caves and was trying to work out whether to go hunting, whether to go gathering, and what they were going to hunt, then I'm sorry. But you're not paying attention to your own families, let alone humanity. But the problem is when the politics starts to be about the politics rather than the goals of the country or the goals of the group of people. When it's more important to win political points and to, I know the phrase that you hear someone own the libs or own whatever. More important to do that than it is to actually deliver on the mission which you're supposed to be doing. That's when there's the problem. Keppel's an example of that, honestly. It's one of the reasons why he's in post for so little time and has so little impact. He's seen Naval Lord September to December 1766. He does practically nothing in that period. Really doesn't get anything achieved. He goes on to be a senior naval officer, but yeah. But he couldn't separate the politics from the service. And that's why he couldn't do it. And we have another example of this to an extent, but Hood, for all his issues, and oh my lord does he have issues, he manages to rein them in. He's political, but he reins them in. He's keeping it to the right balance. You notice he's First Naval Lord. What becomes the First Sea Lord? August 1789 to March 1795, he does it a little bit better than Keppel did. Now, Sir Samuel Hood is a really interesting character, but he does rather demonstrate some of the points. His wife, Susanna Linds, who he married, was the daughter of Edward Linds, who had been the master rope maker at Portsmouth Dockyard and Mayor of Portsmouth. Remember what I said about maritime and naval families sticking together? It was important you understood what you were getting into. It was important you had first-hand knowledge of it. Now, he follows a kind of interesting role because while he's technically First Naval Lord and technically serving in that post, he's also Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet and dealing with the defence and fall of Toulon and Corsica. And when he's eventually recalled, it's because he sends a rather nasty letter, temperate letter as it's sometimes described, home to the other Lords of the Admiralty going, "Where are my frigating ships? I'm short frigating frigates. Where the frigate are my frigating ships?" And so they decide to recall him, but please note, he's still promoted to full admiral. And he's full admiral. That's the most senior he's been. He's been a vice admiral and first naval lord, and he's promoted admiral while first naval lord. And when he returns home, he gets a pension of £2,000 per year for life, which is the equivalent of probably roughly £300,000 a year to life for life these days. And he's made governor of Greenwich Hospital, which also is a remunerated position. He's the Tory Member of Parliament for Westminster, 1784 to 1788 and 1790 to 96, and was member for Reigate as well between 1789 and 1790. He actually didn't die till 1816 in Greenwich. And his wife, the daughter of a rope maker and a mayor of Portsmouth, well, she'd been so well thought of that in 1795, while all this had been going on, she is given her own title, Baroness Hood of Caffrington. He's a viscount, and his viscountcy descends with his children. Goes to his youngest son, Henry, when he... but, yeah, she's given her own title because she's so well thought of. So well respected. So what did he do with all his times? Well, Hood was... he was not a quiet man. But the thing is, he managed to serve fairly well. As mentioned, he stood for the Tory party. That's what he was politically. But honestly, he'd served William Pitt the most. And, well, he felt for him as his most closest political counterpart, realistically. And Pitt described himself as an independent Whig more than a Tory. But, you know, politics makes for strange bedfellows. His appointment to the board of the Admiralty came with a lot of vim and vigour. He was a highly energetic soul, and when he wasn't off doing things in the Mediterranean, he exercised his role to the nth degree. He really did push it. He was largely in charge during a period of almost peace. I will say almost peace. He presided over things like the court-martial of the Mutiny of the Bounty and various other duties when he was in charge in Portsmouth and prior to this and even during this. He was a tough admiral. He instituted very hardline rules when it comes to the, how do I put this politely, the Articles of War, aka the rules by which conduct was governed aboard ship. He was also, and I've got to say this, not really a good administrator. He was, though, for maximising the Navy, maximising its strength and maximising its capability and promoting good officers. He was good at this. He would pick officers out who were young, who were capable, and he would see they got promoted. He was very good at using the patronage system as it was supposed to be, in both an ideal and, well, realistic way. It was Hood who managed this very successfully by also introducing people to other potential patrons. For example, he'd been friends with Maurice Suckling, who was Nelson's uncle. He'd met Horatio Nelson. He mentored him a bit, but most importantly, what did he do? Well, he introduced his mentors to people who could help them survive when their political skills weren't great. Nelson's was never particularly brilliant, unlike Collingwood, who was actually pretty good at the politics stuff. This is why I say Collingwood's actually a better officer for the modern Royal Navy to look to for inspiration than Nelson. Nelson has a fine strategic mind and is a very fine commanding officer. For war. For anything not war, he's bored, he's completely jumping around, and frankly, he's not good for that. He only has one gear. He is the actual person you need to have stored in a glass box with a hammer on it saying, break in case of world war. Then let him out. He'll win it for you. But in peacetime, you want to find something to occupy him far away from where anyone can be watching him, because what he's going to do is going to be nuts. Basically, Nelson is the person who voyages of exploration were made for. Send him far away. Counter-piracy in the Caribbean, he'll annoy locals, but there's no one can really be too annoyed about someone being too efficient at counter-piracy. Just keep him away from where he can get anywhere near politics. But Hood introduced him to the then Duke of Clarence, who was, of course, the future King William IV. He was a serving naval officer at the time, and, well, it made sense to introduce the two. It gave Nelson some measure of royal courtly protection. Although, of course, no one really did realise the Duke of Clarence was going to end up being King William IV at that particular point. He's a naval officer. He's risking his life. You don't usually do that with heirs to the throne, because on ships you can't easily get them out the way. Land campaigns are always easier. You can stick them on a horse and get them as far away from the battle as you can. You can't really do that at sea. Everyone's already in a ship and it's an absolute melee going on. Which is rather appropriate description to also apply to some of Hood's time on the board. It's typified by the fact that, well, the king won't remove Howe from commanding, Admiral Howe, from command of the Channel Fleet because he's such a vaunted leader. But Howe is also sick at this time, so what you have is the naval board, the board of the Admiralty, trying to issue orders to the Channel Fleet, Howe issuing orders to the Channel Fleet as their commander-in-chief, and the Channel Fleet going, what the frig are we supposed to be doing here? This doesn't make sense. We're confused. When realistically, if you were going to send Hood to do something, you should have sent him, or you should have probably sent him to command the Channel Fleet, because you can more easily do that and fulfill the role of senior First Naval Lord. Now, there's also a problem that he gets sent away, but honestly, when he's dealing with the Earl of Chatham, who was John Pitt, William Pitt's elder brother, hence he's the second Earl of Chatham after their father dies, and William goes on to become, William, of course, the younger brother, is Prime Minister, he can sort of get away with it, because, to be honest, the second Earl of Chatham is not as politically forceful as his brother. But when you have Earl Spencer take over later on in his time on the board as First Lord of the Admiralty, Hood doesn't realise he's dealing with someone who's more determined to be his own man, and far more capable in some regards. There's a reason that the Earl Spencer managed to survive as First Lord of the Admiralty from December 1794 to January 1801. You do not survive all that time through all those trials and tribulations because you're not committed to the job and you're not capable of the politics. The thing is, this is the period when the board is really starting to discover what it's going to be, what it is. In some regards, they are starting to enter more of a professional period, but again, you have the issues that the senior naval lord on there is a vice admiral, and the board's trying to issue operational orders to admirals, etc., who are going, excuse me, I want ships. I will take orders from the First Sea Lord, etc. Well, from the First Lord of the Admiralty, but I'm not going as the civilian head of our organisation. But why would I take orders from you? And they sort of do. They sort of get there's writing letters going back and forth, but it's always a complicated scenario. It's always a complicated scenario. Even when Hood becomes an admiral, you have to consider, and part of the reason why you can afford to be Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean Fleet and also serve on the board is because you would take holidays at home, you would come back, and actually when he's dismissed, that's when he's having a fight with the Earl of Spencer, because he hears that the French forces are getting reinforcements and construction's going on. And so basically while he's at home in the UK, he writes a letter and they go, well, you're not going back out again. And, oh, by the way, I'm kicking you off the board at the same time. That takes longer. It takes longer to remove him from the board than it does from the Commander of Mediterranean Fleet. It's interesting to see how they're doing it, because one of the things is he then goes and serves in the political parties. As said, he goes and serves as an MP. But he doesn't really push to become the first Naval Lord. Again, or to become the First Lord of the Admiralty. He doesn't do that. He's now resigned. He's left the Navy. He's still a force in politics, though. He's still really interesting support for the naval vote. And again, he gets a lot of awards still. He gets a lot of, how do I put this politely? A lot of benefits. But it's no longer the same system. It used to be, prior to this, that these roles were almost interdisposed with political positions. It was almost Roman Republic. But by the time you've got to Hood, now there's a separation going on. Yes, we want the expertise. Yes, we want you. One of the interesting things, if you consider, he's got noble titles by the point he is a member of Parliament, and that was not unusual. It was not unusual at this time. He'd go and sit in the House of Lords, but until he took a seat in the House of Lords, he could be a member of Parliament. And now we have Sir George Cockburn. Why did I pick him? Because he served 7 years, 133 days cumulative. Okay? And then look at his service and how split apart it is. And he's First Sea Lord. We are used to the concept of you becoming First Sea Lord, you serving your time, and then leaving the Navy as a senior naval officer. Today, this kind of career would be completely absurd to us, but one of the things to consider is that he spends a lot of his time arguing for the Navy Board to actually be retained. When it's not retained, he has to deal with the changes. And this is the man who basically makes the decision and advises that the best way to do that is to implement a Lord system where the Third Sea Lord basically becomes the Navy Board. Takes on a lot of the duties. A lot of the duties. And what's really interesting with him is in many ways he is the last overtly political naval lord. He literally combines these posts with being a member of Parliament. His first time is September 1828 to 1830, and that's during the Wellington Ministry. It's not his first time as a member of Parliament. He'd first been elected to Parliament in 1818 as the member of Parliament for Portsmouth for the Tory party. But in 1828, well, that's when Wellington, who's Prime Minister at the time, decides, I can use you as Member of Parliament, as First Naval Lord, First Sea Lord. He pushes for the improvement in standards of gunnery, and he actually creates the gunnery school at Portsmouth. That's an important thing, and a very useful thing. That's HMS Excellent. And it's critical for the next the Royal Navy for the next 120 years, let's be honest, is dependent upon that school. That school produces its senior officers in many, many ways. It's considered a key metric of whether you're likely to become a good officer is going through excellent. When the government falls, he resigns as First Naval Lord, and he still remains active. He tries to campaign against the abolition of the Navy Board when it's done in 1832, but when he loses his seat in the 1832 general election, he goes off to become Commander-in-Chief of the North American West Indies Station. Always fun, you know, this is what I'm going to do. Takes out the 4th rate HMS Vernon as his flagship. He then returns during the Peel Ministry, or the first Peel Ministry. And for those who don't know, Sir Robert Peel is very much a reformist government in many, many ways. He resigned again when the government fell from power, but he tried to push for more reforms while he could. And then, when the government does fall from power, he returns to Commander-in-Chief of North American West Indies Station. Becomes a full admiral in January 1837, which is useful because by the time he becomes First Naval Lord again in the second Peel Ministry, he is now a very senior officer, and he can push for steam. And they have had the trials of paddle wheels versus screw propellers, which is better. Screws have won, and he manages to push that through. He also is massively against the idea of using physical punishment for sailors. He regards that should be absolutely the last resort, and preferably never resorted to. And he pushes that through. Now, I would also point out that he does well enough that Cockburn Sound in Western Australia is named after him, as is Cockburn Island, which is to the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. And there's also Cape Cockburn and Cockburn Bay, which are in Canada, are named for him as well. There's also the stern of HMS Implacable, which sits in the National Maritime Museum, and that was one of the vessels he commanded actually during the Walcheren campaign. And, well, thanks to his wife, who was called Mary Cockburn, yes, she was his cousin, they were survived by a daughter, and the descendants of his family are still around in this world. One of them, of course, is a writer called Alexander Cockburn, who I think died in 2012. I think he was a journalist and author of various things. I'm sure I read some books by him, but I cannot remember. Must be somewhere. But most famously most famous of his descendants is probably Olivia Wilde, who's an actress. So just remember, next time you see the Tron Legacy, which came out in 2010, or Cowboys and Aliens, or any of those movies, and you see Olivia Wilde, who's the female lead, I think, in those, just remember, one of her ancestors was a guy called George Cockburn, who was the reforming First Lord of the Navy, of the First Sea Lord of the Royal Navy, and who brought in steam-powered ships, tried to reduce corporal punishment, and also managed to get gunnery school going for the Royal Navy. I'd say that's pretty cool. And he managed to do all that thanks to his political connections. But the thing is, he was always considered a naval officer first. His arguments as a naval officer were above reproach. One of the things that some of his opponents said to him was that they could never argue with him on the naval facts, because on a naval he was always sound. He never used the Navy to make politics. He used politics to make the Navy. That was how he approached it. And that gave him a very sure footing. Which then leads us to Sir William Parker. Now, Sir William Parker is in post 11 days. So really he doesn't do much, but I include him because he is amazing. He has observed the Second Sea Lord. He gets the post of First Sea Lord. This is after he's already been Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet. In between, Second Sea Lord goes off to be then Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, served in the East Indies and China, stationed as Commander-in-Chief and all sorts of things. Then commanded during the First Opium War. He'd done really a lot of war service. And he's dealt with politics before. But literally 11 days go by before, and it must be less than 11 days, it must be literally about 5 or 6 days because of the time it takes to process it and or change these things. And he literally goes from, I'm First Naval Lord, I hate this role. I have to give this up due to ill health and return to command the Mediterranean Fleet for my health. By the way, his health was so bad that he would then go on to live another 20 years. Yeah. The man who was First Sea Lord for literally, I think must have been about 5 days before he decided he had enough. This would serve a total time of 11 days before he could go off to go and command Mediterranean Fleet for the good of his health. I mean, there are worse things to do. But that's kind of an extreme way to say I really don't want to do this job. I have to spend too much time dealing with you all, and I don't want to be involved with you. Now, Sidney Dacus is an example of an officer. By this point, you are talking about a fleet which no longer, think about it, there's not that much long-term service between this gentleman, who goes in July 1846, this person who literally succeeds him for 11 days, because you can. And by 20 years later, the First Sea Lord doesn't have any other political positions, is not a member of Parliament. He had been a Commissioner of the Admiralty, he'd been the second Naval Lord from 1866, but in 1868 he's promoted to First Sea Lord. He only becomes a full Admiral in 1870. He serves 4 years trying to stabilise and form up the Navy, trying to keep things going, especially the experimental squadrons, trying to help the Navy transition in what is the ironclad era. And he had experience commanding ironclads. He had experience working with the various screw-propelled ships. He had a lot of faith in them, and a lot of faith in their ability to be modernised and ability to be improved. He was keen on putting the ironclads into the fleet. In fact, that had been a key thing he'd been doing from 1863 onwards, integrating ironclads into the Navy. And that's one of the reasons why he has the post he has, why he has given the post of Second Naval Lord. It's to integrate the training regime you need to run ironclads. How are you going to maintain them? How are you going to organise for them? How do you do damage control on an ironclad? We're used to wooden ships. Do you patch the iron hull, or do you just use wood? This might seem really obvious to you, but when you're first doing it, they have to figure these things out. They have to work out what they're going to do, how they're going to do it. And so he spends a lot of his time pushing for the integration of ironclads and their organisation. It's his primary job during these 4 years, as he sees it, is making the case to all parties. And one of the reasons he can do that is because he's not an MP. He's not connected to any of the political parties overtly. He's an independent. He's a naval officer through and through. He is independent professional naval advice. The Royal Navy had reached this point. They'd gone from being overtly political as a way to get the funding, to being politically connected to get the funding, to now being politically neutral to maintain the funding. Still having a voice, still making their case loudly, but making a case for the Navy, separate from any political party. Don't place your faith in any one, was now the motto. We place the faith in making the case for the Navy to as many of the public as we can. And whereas that had really worked by a methodical, but in many ways collaborative political methodology, bringing people aboard, building a theoretical band of brothers approach of leadership, Vesey is a Hamilton. Richard Vesey Hamilton is a bit different. He leaves behind this, though. Naval Administration by Richard Vesey Hamilton, which you could go and read, which, by the way, has the beautiful and interesting example that I always tend to bring out when people start telling me the relative powers of the positions. This is a book written by a First Sea Lord, and the first 4 chapters: how the system has grown, the development of administrative means, the Admiralty patent and responsibility of the First Lord, and the existing organisation, are all covered within 58 pages. Okay? Then there is a chapter about the Department of the Permanent Secretary, the Senior Civil Servant. That takes 6 pages. And then the next 3 chapters are all described the Controller's Department, aka the Third Sea Lord's Department. And these 3 chapters span from page 65 to page 101. 35 pages alone on the Controller's Department. There's also a separate section on the Director of Navy Contracts, who is often bridged under the Controls Department. And there's even a few pages on the Director of Naval Intelligence, the Hydrographer of the Navy, Director of Transports, and Director of Architectural and Engineering Works, and Director of Greenwich Hospital in here. It's really quite interesting to go through this, and this is one of those books which is really fun to have. I seem to go through copies because I tell people about it who come to borrow, who need to read it. I loan them my copy, and I seem to never get it back. I should really be better at pressing recall. The thing is, this is a man who's very much focused on naval administration, on getting the Navy to work. He is focused on an early version of the report, which is sort of an early sort of report, which is kind of like what Jackie Fisher will do in his reforms. They're worried about unarmoured ships fighting in future wars, and whether or not they are sensible, and whether or not the Royal Navy can deal with any navy from any other 2 naval powers combined. So he is really critical to the development of the 2-power standard, and making the case for that, and making the case for the Navy on this scale, but also how to structure the Navy, how to organise the Navy. He engages in a lot of debates and discussions about these things, which is one of the reasons why he's quite so versed and able to write this. Because the man is pretty much rebuilding naval administration whilst keeping it the same. Because he can't change it, but he needs to make it work. And what realistically grows a lot is the Third Sea Lord's capacity and the First Sea Lord's capacity. Those are the 2 departments which need to grow the most. In many ways, Dacres and a way before him, Cockburn, had helped with the Second Sea Lord and sorted out the Second Sea Lord's remit and supported that. It's the Third Sea Lord's post had basically taken on the board, as said, the Navy board, but realistically, its harmonisation and getting it to work within the systems is accomplished under the leadership of Richard Vesey Hamilton as First Sea Lord. He's also one of the last First Sea Lords who hasn't been Third Sea Lord. There were a few that came afterwards, but after Third Sea Lord posts had been realistically properly established, until the Third Sea Lord's role was abolished, as in the post was abolished, not the duties. They're still very much there. It was kind of oh, you've been Third Sea Lord. Oh, you're one of the ones tipped to become First Sea Lord then later on. It's very rare. It becomes very, very rare that the person who becomes First Sea Lord has not been Third Sea Lord. His main duty, as he sees it, is managing the transformation of the fleet, but also putting in the necessary infrastructure to transform the fleet. Making it work. Making it proficient. And again, how does he do this? Well, he does this through a lot of persuasion. He does this through a lot of discussion. He does this through working with various political factions within Parliament and external to Parliament. He's one of the first naval officers who actually seeks out the press to discuss things with them. Or rather, the press of their day. Realistically, though, you have to consider his leadership, his skills. The wars he'd fought in was the Second Opium War. He'd taken part in the Battle of Fatsown Creek. He's commanded ships, but he is pretty much a peacetime officer as much as you're going to get in this period. Yet he's trying his best to prepare his navy for war, his service for war. This is a photo of him, by the way, as Rear Admiral. And this painting is of him later, when he was an admiral. So you can see how his decorations and honours evolve between the two. And finally we have Sir Charles Madden. Now Madden is often forgotten, but in many ways he's a beginning of a practice of First Sea Lords not selling the navy to the nation or the political class even, but selling the political class's decisions to the navy. They've always had to be, to an extent, intermediaries. They've always had to be evolved into a sort of the professional service head who would be the intermediary between the two groups. But Madden really does manage to hurt the navy in some regards, making concessions like 50 cruisers at the First London Naval Treaty rather than the 70 which were required. Now, he made that on the basis that he already had 48 and that was all he had, so, you know, asking for 70 was never going to happen. He was never going to get that, and he'd only got 40, he counted the 48 being the ones which were actually new enough for a combat. He didn't count all his cruisers. The overage ones, for example. He needed 70 new ones. Now, you can say the political rationalization was sensible, and you can say his style of leadership was to try and build consensus after the Beatty years and try and get the Navy onto some kind of firm footing. You can also say that he was faced with a very, very difficult political period to manage the fleet in. But saying all that, and the legacy of World War I, he honestly could have done more. There are things buried in the treaty which are good for the British, but one of the things that you see is he doesn't really push. He leaves it far more to the Third Sea Lords around him, rather than he himself trying to push it. To push for the things which are included which actually benefit the Royal Navy. Yes, if you're going to make the concession about cruisers, fine, if you think you have to. But get more out of it. He was probably the least successful if you look at the Washington Treaty and you look at the Second London Naval Treaty, you can argue that the First London Naval Treaty is where the Royal Navy is sold most cheaply. Yes, they make some suggestions that they do get some things out of it. But if you consider the mileage they get in Washington and the mileage they get in the Second London Naval Treaty out of getting what they want, And really, the British, the reason why they don't tend to break the treaty is because they write the treaty in so many ways. In those treaties, he really isn't that successful at pushing that one forward. I can argue that's because he himself is not really a personality who's going to push forward these things. He's far too used to being a second in command. That's been his experience in most of his service. Yes, he did have some duties as Commander-in-Chief. Yes, he has been an Admiral, but he's more often not been taking his lead from someone else, executing someone else's vision when you look at his career. He'd been the Chief of Staff for Jellicoe, all sorts of things. And yeah, he has experience in some command, but he spent, by the point he's in this position in 1927, he spent a large chunk of the last 13 years, as said, executing someone else's vision. And that's realistically a bit of a problem for a First Sea Lord, who is supposed to be arguing backwards and forwards between the two, and acting not so much as an explainer, but an interlocutor, an honest voice for the politicians with the Navy, for the Navy with the politicians. And it's a tough position to be in, it really is. And that brings us to the video's question, realistically, because, you know, I've given you some examples of naval lords and what they've done, and yes, I suppose as we've gone through, they've had less, because, honestly, I've wanted to talk about different things in their personalities, and as you go on, you've already talked about that thing in an earlier naval lord, so now what sets this part of one apart from that, and this one apart from then, so I do apologise they've got a bit shorter, but they're all interesting characters, and I highly recommend this book. I highly recommend Vesey's book. Richard Vesey Hamilton. I should call him Hamilton's book, but Vesey sounds so much cooler. Realistically, the naval lords, the First Sea Lords, they are characters. They are part of the fabric of this organisation. And what I'd like you to do as today's question is to think about them, is to go, if you can, go read them. The Wikipedia page is a perfectly good source. It's free. And I can't think of any other sort of online free resource which you can go and literally find the full list of the naval or First Sea Lords. And what, you know, the various ones before and done. And I'd like you to look up, and I'd like you, if you could, look up one you've never heard of before. One who you've never heard of before. And see if there's anything about them that interests you. Because the thing is, when we consider the history, these men have shaped the Navy at various points. The position has always been political and naval combined. It started off, you wanted someone from both worlds. And has moved to being, you've got someone from the naval world who's got to speak with the politicians and also pass it back. And in some regards needs to have some extra training to deal with that, but try and get them to actually have it. Go and look them up. I guarantee you will find some really random characters, because I specifically avoided some because I wanted to leave them as gems for others to discover. I might get them in the Key Leaders series when that actually finally starts, when I can finally start the regular Friday videos. Who knows? That might come about in a couple of weeks' time. You never know. Slowly, everything's getting organised at the house. But please, as I said, today's question, please go look on, and then comment below which one you found and what you find interesting about them. It'd be really cool. What have we got coming up? Next week is Royal Navy Naval College, Greenwich. Ooh, that's going to be fun. How do they train naval officers there? Thank you very much for watching. Hope you liked. If you liked the video, please like, share, and subscribe. And hope you find it interesting. And a little bit of something else you learned today.